Hello, and welcome to my online talk about my new book, Breaking Peace, Brexit and Northern Ireland, which has just been published by Manchester University Press. My name is Feargal Cochrane, I'm the author, and I'm delighted to talk to you today about it and be talking to you under the banner of the Linenhall Library, which is a brilliant library, and it's been very important in my own work, particularly the political collection. So I'm delighted to be doing this talk on behalf of the Linenhall Library and facilitated by the Linenhall Library. The text was really, most of the manuscript for the book was written during 2019, October 2019, with a quick update towards the end of the year. And it seemed at one point like, oh, well, so much has happened since. But a lot of the themes that we're discussing over these weeks, last week and this week, are very similar to the themes that are going on within the book, which the extent to which Northern Ireland has been a sticking point in the whole Brexit process and the whole difficult, sometimes tedious, nearly always tedious, but still fascinating process of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. And so rather than summarize the whole book, which would probably exhaust me and you, I just want to pull out some of the main themes within it and some of the open questions that are still hopefully pertinent. And I've got some slides as well to hopefully illuminate things. And I'll talk about the title in a second. But the origins of the book really go back to 2016. And in fact, I was running a workshop in Belfast on the 24th of June 2016. Myself and colleagues from the University of Kent flew over on the 23rd of June, Brexit Day, the referendum day. And we were a bit worried about the afternoon sessions because we had this was a conference on devolution and devolved government in Northern Ireland and some of the difficulties pertaining to that. And we had a couple of sessions on Brexit in the afternoon, and we were slightly worried about whether there'd be anything to talk about because, odds on it was going to be a Remain result and maybe a bit of dead air in the room. We needn't be worried. The Prime Minister had resigned by breakfast time the next morning, and the whole conference was taken over with Brexit. And that was really the germ of it. And when I realized what a cataclysmic event had just happened and all the ramifications that would, when I knew some of them anyway during the campaign, but the actual result itself crystallized to me what effect, as I say in the book, a meteor had just landed on the body politic, particularly on the body politic in Northern Ireland, also in Great Britain as well. And I think justifiably 2016 can be said to be, the beginning of Brexit. In Great Britain, people talk about when Brexit's going to happen, at the end of the transitional period or, getting Brexit done by a particular date. But Brexit was done, Brexit certainly started on the 24th of June in Ireland, because that's when the border and lots of other issues to do with identity politics really were put on the front burner again. Even reunification. There was a big push from Sinn Féin and others over trying to get a border poll back on the agenda. So I think 2016 is up there, in terms of the chronology of the political history of Northern Ireland, from 1921 when it was created, 1972 when Stormont was prorogued, 1998 when we had the Good Friday/Belfast Agreement, and 2016, and of course next year we have the centenary in 2021. And I think it raises an interesting question, which is how long can Northern Ireland continue in its current constitutional form? Now, prior to Brexit, I think that would have been scoffed at, probably seen as a thought experiment, nothing more, or an academic conversation. But I think the constitutional arrangements in these islands are now very much on the front burner of political debate, not just in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland, but in Scotland as well. So the whole sort of constitutional fabric of the United Kingdom has really been stressed by the result. For the supporters of Brexit, that may not be a bad thing. They want to get Brexit done. They've pushed it through. They were very clear-sighted in terms of what they wanted, which was to leave the European Union, perhaps for a variety of reasons. But their campaign was certainly very slick. And in comparison to put it diplomatically, a less slick campaign on the part of the Remain side. So I think it's now a legitimate question, which is how far into its next 100 years will Northern Ireland actually get, and will Brexit be, the grit and the oyster of that relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain? And I think Brexit does point to that. Northern Ireland has been a barrier to getting Brexit done. And it is really ironic, really, that the people who want to express their Britishness most avidly arguably are the ones who have imperiled the British identity most directly. And I'll come on to that maybe later on. But it's certainly, I think, 2016, a fulcrum, an iconic year in Northern Ireland's history. So just a little bit of background about myself. I mean, I grew up in East Belfast in the 1970s and 1980s. And it was clear when I was growing up that it was a militarized society. It was not a normal, it was normal to me, but in any sort of textbook sense, it was an abnormal society. It was a militarized environment. Getting in, barriers were part of the way of life. Getting in and out of Belfast wasn't something you just did by accident. It was a conscious decision to go through turnstiles, have your bags checked, sometimes be personally searched by armed police and other sort of specialist security forces, including the British Army. And it was very visible, and therefore identity tended to be quite visible and quite territorially defined. So you would see foot patrols, there was air support, helicopters droning overhead. It was quite a common thing, a constant soundtrack to growing up. So it was quite a sort of militarized situation. And of course, an undeclared war between Provisional IRA, loyalist paramilitaries, and the British state. Another facet of that, of course, was the border. And here's a picture from the 1970s. And, when you crossed the border, you knew about it. There was a long queue. There was a whole infrastructure surrounding the border. There were watchtowers. You were checked, your documents were checked, and you were asked why you were going from one administration to another administration. It was very clear that you were leaving one country and you were entering another country. Republicans may contest the word country, but effectively you were leaving one administrative and political unit and you were entering another one. And it was not an easy thing to do. There was even sort of, bureau de change on the side of the road where we would change our money. And normally it was going on holidays or coming back from holidays. But here, identity and the border was very territorially demarcated and it was very visible. And of course, the peace process demilitarized this and actually took a lot of political heat out of the border itself and what it meant and where it was even. To the point where I once interviewed a journalist writing another book, and I asked, well, what was the best thing about the Good Friday Agreement? To what extent did power sharing or did the North-South bodies really make a difference to people's lives? And, and he said, actually, the best thing about the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement was the motorway. And it was the road, and it was the infrastructure, and it was being able to live in Dublin and work in Belfast, or vice versa. Not be confronted with your identity in a way that was, creating a division between the different communities. And it was just easy. And it facilitated an organic exchange between those who would define themselves as British and those who would define themselves as Irish, and of course had economic benefits as well. And in fact, when I went to the Titanic museum a few years ago, the whole car park underground had Irish registration cars. There was not one Northern car in there. And I thought, well, when I was growing up, you rarely saw cars from the south in the north. It was not that common. There was there was a fear factor, but there was a physical barrier between people moving around between the north and the south. The peace process mitigated that, and today, well, that was before, and this is after, and this is some of you watching this may know about this, but this is a bridge between two little towns. One is Belcoo, and the other is Black Lion, and there's a river that goes between the two, and the border is on that bridge. It's on the river. It's in between. But when you're going across, you have no real idea when you leave Northern Ireland, when you enter the Republic of Ireland. And in fact, the only way I knew was the sat nav in my car, so which I took a picture of because I thought it was quite striking that the sat nav knew where the border was better than I was able to work out in the physical space that I was in. And of course, this is where for a lot of after 2016, this is where there was a lot of fear that there would be a border back on the island of Ireland with all of the paraphernalia, the infrastructure, and the angst that would be associated with that. That all parties recognised, and the British government recognised that as well, and said they were committed to the common travel area and keeping a border out of Ireland, and everybody was committed to keeping a border out of Ireland. And of course, it seemed that eventually, with the fact that Boris Johnson ditched Theresa May's version of a withdrawal agreement and binned the backstop, but then turned around and signed the Northern Ireland Protocol, which effectively, we think, although this may be a hostage to fortune in terms of breaking political events when it's broadcast, but that there will be a border or some checking, whether you call it a border or not, in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, which not everybody, DUP didn't heave a sigh of relief, obviously, and a lot of unionists thought this was a disaster, which we'll get on to in a second, but it at least ostensibly reduced the worry about a border on the island of Ireland, with the implications that would have for the peace process and for security as well. But of course, the DUP were massively hurt by what they referred to as the Betrayal Act, and we'll get on to that in a second. So wherever there's a border, there are going to be people unhappy about it. But this was this is the reality post 2016. This was the worry that roads like this that were nondescript, just looks like an ordinary road, but that's on the border, and that would be potentially not just a border between the United Kingdom and Ireland, but there's a third party involved now. So this there becomes a frontier to the European Union, between the United Kingdom and the European Union, by dint of being Ireland, which would still be in the European Union. So borders suddenly became more complex than they were. Existential dynamics at play. So it's not just a territorial entity. After Brexit, borders became about identities, and that's true in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol just as much as it's true in terms of the hard border in Ireland. If people feel they're being annexed or separated from their kin groups, then it's a worry to them, and it increases their insecurity, and that can only lead to political tension. So people were very aware, people in Ireland were very aware right from the get-go that Brexit was going to create issues with respect to what's going to happen to the border in Ireland, and how is that circle going to be squared. And I've got a question mark at the end of the slide there, because we're still, again, hostage to fortune. I'm not sure about the news whenever this is broadcast, but it's still unclear as to the manifestation of the border, regardless of where it's going to be. How many checks will there be? How physical will it be? How intrusive? How costly? What are the implications of it in terms of political tensions in Northern Ireland, and even the security situation? So a lot of these things are still unclear, and that's 4 years after the referendum and months before we're actually, if you like, going live in January next year. So the title is probably worth a mention, because it is a provocative title and needs a little bit of context. Now, for most of the time I was writing the book, I had a question mark at the end of the title. There's a breaking peace, question mark. But during the course of writing it, I just dispensed with the question mark, because even if you look at Anglo-Irish relations, you know, the relationship between Britain and Ireland, to the United Kingdom government and the Dublin government, was the cement in the peace process. Back in the 70s, Northern Ireland was seen as a piece of domestic, a domestic matter for the United Kingdom, rather than something that the Irish government should be consulted about. And of course, that gradually changed with the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, and eventually became a relatively bipartisan issue, where yes, there would be disagreements and tensions, but they were rarely public. And post 1985, certainly during the peace process in the 1990s, and again, yes, there were instances of spats that eventually sort of came to the surface, but an awful lot of the arguing was done indoors, and joint press conferences outside on the steps of Downing Street or on the steps in Dublin. It was rare that you would have public disagreements. There were a lot of joint communiques, and the body language and the mood music was very much that this is a joint operation, and we may have different emphases, but we've got the same purpose. And the peace process, certainly from 1993, from Brooke Mayhew talks and from the frameworks documents and so on, into 95, and obviously 1998. Eventually, the British and Irish governments became, joint custodians of the peace process, co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, that hasn't been unproblematic, but their position has been, and they've signed into international treaties, a joint effort that they're both committed to. And the Irish state reformed its own constitution in 1998, following a referendum, to take account of the fact that they were all in it together. We're all signing up to this international treaty called the Good Friday Agreement, and we've all got solemn pledges and undertakings enshrined within that. But that has evaporated over the last several years. There's very few joint communiques between London and Dublin these days. And over the recent legislation introduced by Boris Johnson, that looks like it's backtracking from the protocol. And again, I'm not sure if that's been passed or not. I'm recording this on the day of one of the readings of the legislation. There's an issue now of bad faith, and it's hanging like a stink over Brexit, and it's hanging like a stink in terms of the political relationships between Ireland and Britain. And the worry is that if the relationship between London and Dublin sours and continues to sour, then the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement is really going to struggle. And that's just one aspect. There are other aspects, which is that the European Union is woven into the fabric of the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. There are commitments within the Good Friday Agreement to European legislation and human rights standards that the UK may back away from and will not be held to once it leaves, particularly if it leaves in a no-deal scenario. And there are other aspects of the Brexit process as well. One of the main ones being that it didn't confuse the identities in Northern Ireland. Actually, the positions of the DUP, which was very pro-Brexit, albeit it was pragmatic up to the vote, but it became very pro-Brexit, particularly once it held the balance of power in 2017 after the election. But it was very much a pro-Brexit party during the campaign itself. And of course, the SDLP and Sinn Féin and the Alliance Party very much remain parties. And if you look at the nationalist vote, some sort of 88 to 90% of nationalists are Remainers, and only about 35 to 38% of Unionists are Remainers or were Remainers. That figure may be growing depending on how much of a disaster Brexit becomes. Of course, it may not be a disaster; it may all work out fine. So there is that issue as well, that the ethno-national identities, the tension within the unionist and nationalist communities was actually underwritten by the Brexit vote. It wasn't in any way diluted or complicated by Brexit. So there's that as well, and you know, as well, it provided another barrier. I mean, I'm not saying that the peace process and the institutions didn't have their problems. Of course they did, and the parties were doing a pretty good job of breaking peace without Brexit prior to 2016. But it did squeeze the political space, and in fact, what it did was it meant that it was quite difficult for moderate nationalists and probably some moderate unionists to see a future within a United Kingdom that was more than just England, that was Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that was outward looking and cosmopolitan. And Brexit, whether you agree or not, Brexit almost shrink wrapped the British brand into being an English brand, and it looked like increasingly, and I think this the view in Scotland is sort of similar to that, that London was calling the shots, and the devolved government actually counted for a lot less than it may have done, because of course the self-determination was ignored in both Northern Ireland, which voted to remain, and in Scotland as well. And here we've got sort of pictorial examples of that sort of English nationalist campaigning. And one of the key things in the book that I wanted to just maybe draw out was about the framing of the language of Brexit and trust within the political system, because trust is still an issue, as I've already mentioned, in terms of Anglo-Irish relations. But the absence of trust has bedeviled the negotiations for the British government and for the European Union as well. And I just want to point to Theresa May's Lancaster House speech in 2017. This was in January 2017, which is effectively the UK government setting out its stall to the EU about the type of Brexit they wanted and what they were going to try and negotiate about. And there's two interesting dimensions to this, and these run like a thread throughout the whole book. One is the framing of the language, and the second is the aspirational tone of the language itself. That an awful lot of the negotiation has been about what the British government would like to see happen, right? And that's a different thing to what it's going to do. Those things are different. And when you add that into sort of a conflict environment, that can become quite combustible, because in a conflict, people are more likely to take a worst case scenario than they are to say, oh, it'll probably be fine, probably work out. Now, on the framing point, this is a direct quote from Theresa May's Lancaster House speech in January 2017, and it's in the book. A little over 6 months ago, the British people voted for change. They voted to shape a brighter future for our country. They voted to leave the European Union and embrace the world. And of course, it's the British people voted for change. And from the beginning, from 2016, once 24th of June 2016, after that point, the 16 million people who voted against change were effectively ignored and written out of the narrative. From time to time, there would be a doffing of the cap to the fact that, well, of course, you know, we want everybody to get past this, and you know, and we want the country to heal. But they wanted the country to heal by people accepting what the 17 million people wanted, not what the 16 million people had voted for. So there was if you like, a misnomer there, or a sleight of hand going on by saying that the British people voted for change, and it should have said some British people voted for change and some British people voted for the status quo, but it didn't, of course, because it was trying to present a coherent plan for UK policy in the negotiations. And of course, they voted to leave the European Union and embrace the world. They voted to shape a brighter future. Now, I'm sure some people who voted for Brexit did vote for those things, but of course, the referendum was a very blunt instrument. Do you want to remain in the European Union, or do you want to leave? We don't know very much beyond that simple choice in terms of the reasoning of people. And in fact, had it been about the pros and cons of membership of the European Union, then there would have been a lot more debate about that during the referendum campaign. And actually, other things were going on there, mainly immigration and the future of the Conservative Party. And there was an awful lot of the Brexit referendum was about a civil war within the Conservative Party, as much as it was about these issues about whether there would be a global Britain and what it would do post EU. So there was a couple of issues there. One is that 16 million people didn't vote for change, and secondly, two of the nations in the United Kingdom, Scotland and Northern Ireland, expressly didn't vote for change. They voted to remain within the European Union, and again, their self-determination was effectively trumped by UK sovereignty. And this is again where there's a sort of reductionism back, almost like being a film director where the camera just pulls back, like on a horror film. When devolved parliaments had created space and obviously got devolved powers, but it was clear after the Brexit referendum that these were not independent countries. These powers were, and that was quite right, they're not independent countries. But the point being that the self-determination of both of them was ignored, and the writ of London was what mattered. And in effect, it was saying, we are one country. The United Kingdom is one country, and we will leave as one country. And that, again, it cut through the ambiguity that was absolutely central to the peace process. The necessary ambiguity where we could agree to differ about where we may end up. And of course, we could adhere to different identities. I could be Irish, I could be British, I could be Irish and British. But after the referendum, it's a binary choice. It's leave or remain. You're one or the other. And it sucked the political air out of that ambiguity, and that was quite problematic because it instantly you had the DUP and eventually the Ulster Unionist Party, and certainly Jim Allister's TUV, saying we have to do what the rest of our country is doing. We are one country. We are part of the United Kingdom, and we will leave as part of our country. It attached the Brexit outcome to the ethno-national tension. And similarly, Sinn Féin immediately called for a border poll and said that the Brexit, being pulled arbitrarily out of the EU, was an English nationalist act, was a malign act, and it questioned the moral authority. I think it was Martin McGuinness questioned the moral authority of the United Kingdom, to remain in control. And there should be a border poll ASAP, if you like. And of course, what that did is it squeezed people to the margins, and it made it extremely difficult for the DUP and Sinn Féin to come anywhere near each other, given their other problems and other difficulties. So the language and the language was one thing, and the aspiration was another. So this is, well, we would like to do this, but what will they actually do? Now, again, this is the Theresa May's Lancaster House speech. Another phrase from it: we will work to deliver a practical solution that allows the maintenance of the common travel area with the Republic, while protecting the integrity of the United Kingdom's immigration system. Nobody wants to return to the borders of the past, so we will make it a priority to deliver a practical solution as soon as we can. So what you can see there is, a willing spirit that at first glance that looks relatively benign, that there is a goodwill to work to deliver practical solutions, but you'll see that it's contingent on other things. It is not a guarantee. It is not a standalone promise, even if those things could be believed. It is contingent on something else: protecting the integrity of the United Kingdom's immigration system. And the second sentence: nobody wants to return to the borders of the past. Of course, nobody wants that. But that doesn't mean they're not going to get borders. And as soon as we can could be the 12th of never. So in a political nanosecond, people in Northern Ireland, with their antennae very highly tuned, saw through that as effectively being just words on a page. And of course, the Irish government saw that as well, as did the European Union. And so it increasingly became problematic, I think, in the negotiations, that words and deeds did not match up, and that the language, with the internal warfare of the Conservative Party, was not reliable enough as a way of negotiating and having a solid foundation with your negotiating partner. And of course, that's writ large now, when you have Boris Johnson having signed up to an international treaty, an international law, trying to use domestic legislation to almost overwrite the obligations within that international treaty. So again, you've got an issue there of bad faith, and negotiating with a partner in bad faith. It's just it's a house built on sand. There is very little legitimacy, and very little you can rely on when you don't actually believe the good faith of your negotiating partner. And so, while Theresa May, I'm sure, did this in good faith at the time, increasingly it was clear that she couldn't deliver, didn't have the parliamentary authority to deliver any of these ambitions. And there was a disjuncture between, what they wanted to see and what they could actually do. And of course, this border friction has now sort of last year sort of flipped across, with Boris Johnson coming out against Theresa May's version of the withdrawal agreement, and saying that he'd rather be dead in the ditch than accept it and the backstop. And he successfully binned the backstop, but he did that by agreeing to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the Northern Ireland Protocol, as I've explained, it keeps Northern Ireland inside the European Union, while Great Britain will leave the European Union in terms of certain trading and customs arrangements. And the best way of saying that, it's a bit like a swimming pool, where Northern Ireland is in the deep end of the swimming pool in terms of the customs regulations, and London is in the shallow end, if you like. Johnson at the time said, this was a great deal, and effectively what he did was he cut loose the DUP, much to their annoyance. It was interesting that his allies in the Conservative Party all rallied around, including the Brexiteers, including the European, the ERG, the European Research Group. They all peeled off from the DUP as well and backed what now seems to be a very hastily arranged and drafted agreement. But nonetheless, it was an international treaty. It's in effect. And the United Kingdom government's position is that they are now railing against it. Again, what that does is it decreases the remaining trust between the negotiating partners, which at the time of this broadcast is at a pretty low ebb in terms of the megaphone diplomacy taking place. And so we've had now worries from like the nationalist community that there'd be a border on the island of Ireland, and then the unionist community that there'd be a border in the Irish Sea. And one thing that Boris Johnson has effectively done is he has united everybody in Northern Ireland in distrust of him, both nationalists and unionists. But there are still clearly some time to go, and some more twists and turns in exactly the manifestation of the border whenever it does emerge. And so we've now seen an attempt to try and redraw the border. And a lot of people during the campaign were saying, why are people so neurotic about where the border is going to be, or wanting every dot and comma sorted out in advance? Why are they weaponizing the Irish border? This was sort of Brexiteer argument. Why are they weaponizing the border when there are practical solutions that can be done through technology and through electronic customs agreements? Why are they getting so head up about it? And again, there is an Irish history lesson here, which is that initially in 1921, it took until 1925 for the Northern Ireland border to actually be ratified. And in the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, a boundary commission was set up to adjudicate and arbitrate on the final sort of border arrangements. And effectively, this was a political device to try and get nationalists and unionists to buy into the treaty. And eventually, of course, the borders were rubber stamped, and the Irish Taoiseach at the time, William Cosgrave, was very upset and went to the British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and said, look, I was led to believe that local consent would matter and the border would be changed. And Stanley Baldwin said, well, no guarantees were given, and David Lloyd George may have said that, but times move on. And of course, that was a learning curve for the sort of early years of the Irish state. And in Ireland, people don't forget their history, and so they were very concerned about exactly where the border was going to be and what guarantees were going to be given. Which brings us to sort of another point, really, which is that being, and this is sort of coming on to the Good Friday Agreement now, really, which is that Brexit has stress tested the agreement in lots of ways. One way it stress tested it is that nobody saw Brexit coming. It was like a meteor from space that just landed on us in 2016. And an awful lot of what people thought they were negotiating about in 1998, well, the context to some of that changed after 2016. So, as some people said to me when I was writing the book, and it's in the book, being a nationalist, agreeing to be, live within the United Kingdom under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, within the context of the European Union, is completely different to agreeing to be within the United Kingdom without that protective layer of the European Union. And the European Union is woven into the agreement in terms of European Court of Justice and European oversight of the legislation of the Assembly, for instance. So there's a lot of the fingerprints of the EU are clearly there in the agreement. And to sort of pull that rug away does change the dynamics of the agreement itself. And it comes back to this fundamental point of consent. The whole peace process has been based on the consent of the people who live in Northern Ireland. And all of a sudden, we now live in an era, it seems, where the consent of people in Northern Ireland is secondary to effectively what the British government and London want to do. And that's made things trickier in terms of the political relationships in Northern Ireland, I think. And it's also reduced the ambiguity about some of the identity-related questions linked to Britishness and Irishness. And again, I've pointed back to sort of megaphone diplomacy between Dublin and London. And during the peace process, yes, it was just symbolic. It didn't help deal with a lot of the sectarian problems in Northern Ireland, but symbolism is still important. It does provide a signal. And there were signals that the relationship was thawing, in fact, had thawed between the British state and the Irish state, with visits from the Queen to Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and a state visit from the Irish President to Great Britain, and lots of very friendly words about good neighbourliness and so on. And that's declined noticeably since. And there's some. Just wanted to finish with a couple of ironic observations, really. One of the ironic points is that it was all about taking back control. Brexit was about taking back control, but in fact, control has not been taken back, at least not yet. Control over Brexit really went to the courts. It went to civic society. Went to people taking cases in the courts to try and pull the executive into the legislature and get legislative oversight of the Brexit process. And also, one of the ironies is that the people who have pursued Brexit and say they want their country back most avidly are the ones who arguably have jeopardised the union, not just in terms of Northern Ireland, but in terms of Scottish independence as well. And Sinn Féin, for their part, who had been Eurosceptics and actually had been a bit ambivalent at best about whether Northern Ireland deserves self-determination in the first place, because it's a partition state back in 1920-21. Well, there are no stronger champions of self-determination in Northern Ireland now than Sinn Féin. So that's in itself a sort of an ironic twist as well. And of course, the whole fact that the border is now forcing the DUP to erect its own customs posts, you know, at the border in Northern Ireland with Great Britain is a tremendous irony, but it's not one that nationalists should be in any way smug about, because the last thing that Irish nationalists need is an insecure unionism. So that's really not going to help nationalists in the longer run, I wouldn't have thought. Breaking peace. Is it breaking peace? I think it's a question. I think Brexit is breaking peace. I think the degree to which it breaks is dependent and contingent on how hard Brexit lands. If there's a deal, then I could see you know, it's being a less problematic experience, but it's still going to be a negative one. I don't think there's any good Brexit happening anytime soon. I think if there's no deal, I think if Britain backs away from the protocol, and then if the EU requires a border in Ireland to protect the single market, then I think that's going to be a different matter. And that is extremely worrying. At that point, pardon me, that's extremely worrying. So I just want to thank you all for watching. I just want to thank Manchester University Press again for publishing the book. Thank you for listening. I hope some of that was interesting. I'd like to thank the Linen Hall Library again for hosting the event. If you want to find out more about Breaking Peace, there's a link there to Manchester University's Press's website. And you can also find a virtual book launch webinar on Manchester University Press's website as well, where I'm in conversation with Dr. Catherine Simpson, where we're talking through some of these issues and answering some questions. And sorry I couldn't answer any questions this evening, and hopefully I will see you in the physical space once the coronavirus abates. But for now, thanks very much, and thanks for listening.